there was an internal struggle at Squaresoft about how Final Fantasy should be designed moving into the future. Hironobu Sakaguchi's philosophy from the beginning had been that he wanted it to feel like a diorama. If you have played Fantasian, you will see exactly what was in his mind all the way back from the beginning. Yoshinori Kitase wanted to change that. He wanted the characters to be more proportioned, more cinematic in presentation. Final Fantasy VII, you saw this really interesting compromise between those two things, where half the game is little chibi Lego dudes, and half of the game is taller, proportioned, more human-like anime style, cinematically presented. And so he tells them, I will let you do Final Fantasy VIII with your own team, your own way. When Kitase showed Sakaguchi what they were doing, he hated it. We have a really great episode for you today. We collaborated with Daryll from FinalFantasyUnion to do the development history of Final Fantasy IX. A lot of great info you're going to want to stick around for. But we are very pleased today to tell you that this episode is brought to you by Flydigi.
If you're seeking a premium gaming controller that combines innovation with customization, the Flydigi Apex 4 stands out as a top contender. This controller introduces the world's first force-adjustable alloy joystick, allowing you to fine-tune resistance for a personalized gaming experience.
What I like the best about this controller is just how it feels in my hands. The quality of the build is immediately apparent. For years now, I've been using PlayStation controllers on PC, and of course my Nintendo Switch Pro for Switch games. And the second that I switched to the Apex 4, I knew I was never going back. This is because the Apex Pro uses Hall effect sensors rather than the resistive components that wear down over time in traditional controllers. So with this, you're not going to have to worry about that stick drift that tends to happen with the Switch controllers. I ended up doing my entire playthrough of Expedition 33 with this controller, and it honestly did make it a joy to play.
Overall, the Flydigi Apex 4 offers a blend of advanced features and customization options, making it a compelling choice for gamers seeking high-performance controllers. They also have other options available. The Apex 4 is, of course, the flagship controller, but there are other options such as the Vader 4 and other controllers that you can also purchase from their website.
Visit shops.flydigi.com and enter the discount code ResonantArc for a 10% discount on your order today. We are here today joined by a very special guest. Daryll from FinalFantasyUnion is with us. How are you doing today, man?
I'm good, thanks. How are both of you?
We're doing good. Kason is recovering from pneumonia.
Oh, geez, yeah. If my throat's a little scratchy today, I apologize. But yeah, pneumonia, but I got better.
You got better.
Yeah, I got better.
How about your son, though? Because your son also...
Yeah, he had it as well, but he healed way faster than me.
Oh, good.
But he had it longer. He got sick way before me, so it took us longer to catch it for him. And as soon as he got diagnosed, I was like, I think I have it too. So, yeah, anyways, we're all doing great.
Glad you're doing better. Daryll, I would be shocked if there was anyone in my audience who didn't know who you were, but just in case, you want to go ahead and give an intro to FinalFantasyUnion, what you guys do over there.
Sure. So, so I am the host and the voice and I guess the creative director of FinalFantasyUnion. So we're a YouTube channel that talks primarily about Final Fantasy, and it's through a lens of history and nostalgia and general enjoyment. The idea that when we set up the channel was to make it so that we don't pick favorites as such. We try to make sure that everything we do is inclusive. We try and cover each game with a positive stance, because the fan base can be divisive sometimes. We've been in the camp before as well in the past when we used to do other content as well. But when we set this up, we really wanted to make sure that it was inclusive. And it's been doing pretty well. And hopefully it's going to continue to do so.
So this is the first time that we have ever sat down to do like a video collaboration, which actually shocks me because you and I have been having conversations behind the scenes. I contributed a short paragraph to the first book that you guys kickstarted, The Legacy of the Crystal, a couple years back. What was that, 2020 that you guys kickstarted that?
2021 at the end, I think.
Yeah. And you've just kickstarted another book. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Correct, yeah. So after we did the first book, I'd had a few ideas about what we could potentially do as a follow-up, and one of them was summons. I wasn't too sure if it was going to conceptually work, and I was able to write the first book during that kind of COVID period where work was a bit confusing and I had a bit of downtime. But then, writing a book is quite a considerable effort. You need a lot of perseverance and dedication.
That's true.
And it was hard because I started a new job in 2022, and I just couldn't get myself in the right frame of mind to really explore it. Obviously, at the beginning of this year, I was unfortunately made redundant, so I got a load of time, and I was able to really explore the concept properly to see if it would actually work, because I'd done a few bits here and there, but I needed to actually properly flesh it out before I really committed to it. And once I'd written about sort of 70-80%, we went live with it. So it's essentially the same concept, but now we're talking about summons. So there's 88 summons in the game. So it's every summon that has been summonable in a mainline entry.
Wow.
There are some that appeared first in a spin-off and then became staples. And then we've tried to give, similar to the first book, as much focus as possible. So it's kind of shared. There are 14 summons who get a little bit more exposure than others because of the way the franchise works, right? It's
right, Shiva.
The summons that everyone knows are the ones that were introduced in Final Fantasy 3.
Right.
And there have been very few after that managed to really fight their way into the general roster. And so those ones have been given a bit more of a spotlight, and then all the other ones have either got 1 or 2 pages just to talk about why they exist, what was unique about them, how they continue to be used if they were. Some of them just disappeared after one entry. And so it's kind of just looking at studying each of the summons, really.
Very cool.
The campaign just absolutely just smashed it. It did way better than the last book. I was concerned that people would be less interested because it's more of a conceptual topic than the games themselves. But it's just done absolutely amazingly well. And thank you to everyone who's supported, really.
Well, congratulations. And you were telling us that although the campaign is technically over, people can still come in and give pledges now. There's a new feature on Kickstarter that allows that, right?
Exactly, yeah. So we're using a feature called late pledges, which means if you did miss out, then you're able to still go in and back the book. And that should be the case for the next couple of months until we enter into full production.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations. That is amazing news.
Oh, yeah.
You guys have been killing it for years over at Final Fantasy Union. Always appreciate seeing your stuff. And glad to have you on, particularly for this episode, since it's a dev history episode on Final Fantasy IX. Before we really dig into that, I want to kind of go around real quick and just kind of get your general feelings about Final Fantasy IX. Why don't we start with Kason first? I know that Landon, your older brother, bought a PlayStation, got FF9 on it years and years ago. And so you have kind of some nostalgic ties to that with your brothers and things like that. So
yeah, it was right before he basically had left to go to college. I basically inherited his PS1 at the time, I guess. But there was a time for a few months where he was still around and stuff, but he had a real job. He was like a construction demolition guy or something, and he had a job that made like decent-ish money, so he could actually like buy stuff, and that was fun. So he just went out to buy a PS1, and I remember thinking like, you can just buy your own game console? Like, holy crap, this is crazy. And so he bought it, and he got FF9, and I hadn't heard anything about FF9. All I really cared about was FF7 because I had played it before, but I hadn't been playing like really any of the other games. And so when he brings back FF9, my thinking was like, it's going to be like FF7, right? And it's kind of not.
No.
I did like the more medieval setting. I did like a lot about it, but some of it was kind of vibed weird with me. But the one thing that instantly clicked with me was the music. I was obsessed with the music. And then as the game went on, the world became very interesting to explore. And especially around the time that you get to the story arc with Sir Fratley, and you're able to fuse weapons to have a dual wielded sword. I was like, all right, this game's dope. Like, let's do it. I got really into the game. So that's my first experience with it. It was really just me and my brother playing it, mostly me just watching him, I suppose. And just, absorbing the story. And I loved it.
Yeah. How about you, Daryll? What is your history with FF9? When did you play it? What was your first Final Fantasy? I don't know if I've ever heard your story.
As a wonderful European, my first one was 7 because it's the first one we had.
Right.
Yeah.
And my experience with 9 is actually quite interesting because 7 I played by complete accident. My next door neighbor had a bootlegged PC copy that they brought back from Malaysia, and that was my experience to the game.
Nice.
With the game, sorry. And 8, I had no idea it was really even coming out when it did. They had like a PlayStation like themed magazine, official PlayStation did like a Final Fantasy 8 themed magazine that was all about it, and it had the demo in over here. I got that and was just thoroughly invested, but I had no idea when the game was coming out because like back then information was so sparse. And like I only knew the game came out because one of my friends came over and was like, oh, by the way, did you know Final Fantasy VIII's out now? And I was like, really? Okay, well, let's go get that then. Final Fantasy 9 was the first one where I was properly bought in to the franchise by that point. So I was anticipating it. I pre-ordered the game. I remember when it came. But then kind of similar to you, Kason, I only knew like the Kitase mold Final Fantasy games on the PlayStation.
Right.
And so this was like a very different experience. And initially I wasn't too sure how I felt about it. And yeah, the music was the thing I think that really drew me in. I remember having like really strong reactions to some of the specific scenes in ways that I hadn't done with the previous games, where, like the emotional cues in Final Fantasy are generally like the romantic things, and that's what pulls on the heartstrings, whereas 9 was a lot more visceral with some of the other emotions that Zidane feels as he progresses through the story, and the music plays a huge part in that. But it was like one of those ones where like I finished it and I wasn't too sure how I felt about it, but I think as I've got older, because I was like 15, maybe 16 when I played it, my opinion has very much like definitely changed over time. But yeah, initially I was like, this isn't quite what I expected. But in a way, it wasn't really for me as a fan. It was for like the ones that came before.
Yes, exactly. I think this is a really good launching point for the discussion on the philosophy behind how Final Fantasy IX was made. And I think your story is very similar to many of ours who learned about Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
That, PlayStation era Final Fantasy. And in Europe, like you were saying, you didn't even have a chance. There were no Final Fantasy ports or releases in Europe up until Final Fantasy VII. So for those who don't know the background and the history of the series, to very briefly give a history there, the NES trilogy was developed by a select core of individuals who, many of them, did not continue developing after the NES. So when the Super NES came around, they went to develop games like the Saga franchise or the Mana franchise, and new junior developers came in, like Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, and others, who were junior developers during the Super Nintendo era. Through both of those eras, Hironobu Sakaguchi was the director and the sort of the driving force creatively behind those first 6 entries. When the PlayStation came around, a lot of those junior developers became senior developers. Yoshinori Kitase went on to direct Final Fantasy VII and 8. And Tetsuya Nomura became the lead character designer and was writing the story for a lot of Final Fantasy VII among collaboration of many other developers. And Hironobu Sakaguchi became an executive at Squaresoft. He became, I think, the executive vice president and the president of the American arm of Square or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly, Daryll?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's pretty much on point.
Yeah. So at that point, there was an internal struggle a little bit about certain ways of how Final Fantasy should be designed moving into the future. Hironobu Sakaguchi's philosophy from the beginning had been that he wanted it to feel like a diorama.
Yeah.
They had these little tiny characters running around inside of a little diorama world. If you have played the game Fantasian, you will see kind of exactly what was in his mind all the way back from the beginning. Yoshinori Kitase wanted to change that. He wanted the characters to be more proportioned, more human-like, a little bit more cinematic in presentation. He had ambitions to be a filmmaker at one point in his life. And so Final Fantasy VII, you saw this really interesting compromise between those two things, where half the game is little chibi Lego dudes, and half of the game is taller, proportioned, more human-like anime style, cinematically presented cutscenes and things like that.
For the cutscenes and for the battle scenes were more proportioned.
Also, story-wise, Final Fantasy VII was definitely a bit revolutionary, a step in a little bit of a different direction from some of the previous games. And it was a major, gigantic, era-defining hit.
Yeah.
So at that point, there were some arguments going on behind the scenes. I read some interviews. I sent you some. There's a great interview. I don't know if you've seen this one, Daryll, from Edge Magazine. Have you read that retrospective from Edge Magazine? I think came out like 2020 or 2019 or something like that. Maybe 2017.
Potentially. There's also that huge one with Polygon as well, isn't there, where they kind of run into a lot of the different things.
Yeah. In the Edge Magazine interview, it was funny to read how frank Kitase and Sakaguchi were about their disagreement on this exact thing. And so he tells them, I will let you do Final Fantasy VIII with your own team, your own way. And we're going to split into 3 different Final Fantasy teams. So we're going to have your team doing Final Fantasy VIII, my team in Hawaii, who will simultaneously be beginning this movie project, Final Fantasy Spirits Within.
Yeah, in Hawaii as well. Yeah.
And making this giant freaking movie studio, state-of-the-art tech, just exceptionally expensive project here, all on the funds that came from Final Fantasy VII, right?
Right.
And I will take Final Fantasy IX, and then we'll have another team who will be led by Tanaka and developing Final Fantasy XI, this new MMO project. So we now have 3 separate teams for the first time in the series history working on Final Fantasy in totally different directions. Final Fantasy before this time had always been developed by one core team, at least as far as the main series goes. You know, we've covered, of course, Final Fantasy Tactics and others that were kind of side projects.
Those are different.
So all of this being said, when Kitase showed Sakaguchi, who was credited as an executive producer on Final Fantasy VIII, so he's not creatively involved really, what they were doing, he was like, this is cool, but like, do we really have to have the characters look this way? Does it really have to be a kind of like a high school drama? Like, he had all these reservations about it. He didn't like certain things. And this was kind of a split between them a little bit. Now, none of this is to pass judgment or any kind of qualitative statement on Final Fantasy VIII or something like that. We've done a podcast series on Final Fantasy VIII. We like it a lot. We've done a podcast series on Final Fantasy X, which Kitase and his team did after this, which we really, really love. So it's nothing like that. It's just to say that there was disagreements on how it should be done. So when Daryll says that his expectations were a little different when he went into Final Fantasy IX and that he felt like it was a little bit different there, I think that's a really key thing to, I think, put a point on, is that it does feel different. But what it feels different from is Final Fantasy VIII and VII
Yeah.
What it's actually doing, or what it's attempting to do, is return to form back into Final Fantasies 1 through 6.
Yeah.
That's kind of more what it's going for there. And that you can read Ito, the director for Final Fantasy 9, right? Interviews from him, interviews from Sakaguchi, several others, who basically all say that this is exactly kind of what they were going for. Okay, I've actually got a couple really funny quotes. So here's one from Sakaguchi. To be honest, when I heard their idea to write the game like a high school drama, he's referring to Final Fantasy VIII here,
Yeah.
I was concerned. Because of the approach they took with that game, I pulled the rudder hard back the other way with FF9. I wanted to go right back to the beginning of the series with a traditional fantasy story, knights, castles, and so on. I figured that would restabilize the series somehow. And then we have Shinji Hashimoto, who was an executive producer.
Executive.
Who is echoing similar sentiments there. Sakaguchi-san wanted it to be completely different from Final Fantasy 7 and 8, with a story and flavor that was distinctly his. I'm actually really curious about this with you, Daryll, in particular, because, you talked about you had different expectations. You weren't really sure how you felt about this one, but your feelings evolved over time. In light of all the research you've done on the series and things like that, what do you feel, or what do you think are some of the key differences philosophically, design-wise, in FF9 in comparison to FF8 or 7?
That's a very big question. I think that it really, obviously, a big part of it, what they wanted to put in there was nostalgia. They wanted to have big throwbacks to the past. And I think that, one of the quotes that when I was just doing a bit of cursory research for this, actually, that Sakaguchi had said that, Final Fantasy, when they were working on it, especially throughout the 8-bit, 16-bit era, and, Kitase took this really to heart, was that they always wanted Final Fantasy to be the absolute best game. And the concept of best evolved over time. So initially they were kind of competing with Dragon Quest, and then they wanted to be the best RPG. About Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI, their ambition was, we want to be the best game. We want to be getting nominated for Game of the Year. And then with 7, it was, okay, we want to be like the technological leader of the world. We want to be seen as this, like, the pinnacle of game development, that we're going to make one of the best games of all time. That was like their mindset. But with 9, Sakaguchi said, we don't want to aim for that. Like, we don't want to be the best technically. We're not going to go for high, big budget. We just want to be a Final Fantasy game. And I think, that to me was an interesting shift, because Sakaguchi was the ultimate gatekeeper, right? It was his franchise. And, you were mentioning about that he wanted team members to go off and flourish, but some of those were because there were just huge creative, discussions, let's say.
Yes.
And with Tanaka, one of the things I found in that initial research I was doing around 4 was that Tanaka and a few other people really felt that Final Fantasy should be an action RPG. Yeah. They felt that turn-based was antiquated, that the market didn't want that. And so the original Final Fantasy IV was an action RPG. And Sakaguchi was just like, no, like, if we do that, we're going to alienate the fan base we've built over the last 3 games. That's a really bad decision. But what I'll let you do is take what you've got conceptually, and you can try and run with that on your own. And then Ito also wanted to do action, but he was like, well, I guess I've got to do what the boss says, so I'm going to make pseudo action. Right?
ATB, right?
Yeah.
And I feel as though that was kind of how he operated throughout his view. Like, he had a very clear idea about what Final Fantasy was and what it should be. And I think that what you described there in terms of that 3-team setup, which kind of eventually became 4 when Matsuno came into the fray as well, was that he realized that, okay, so he may have a vision about what Final Fantasy was, but Final Fantasy had actually outgrown that vision. Kitase had brought in a whole new fan base that was kind of at odds with what he felt the franchise was. It was kind of much bigger than that now. And he appreciated that there needed to be games that accommodated for the different wants and needs of the fan base. So yeah, like 10 was going to be for the Kitase audience, like the me's and the Kasons, let's say. There was 9, which was for the ones that came before, like those that really loved 6 and prior to that. 11 was a whole new audience they were going to go after, and then 12 was, you know, obviously going to be for the people that liked the really serious, like gritty, like Vagrant Stories and Tactics style, which of course there was a market for as well. And I think that's what really stood out to me when I was playing through 9, and why I gained more appreciation over time, because I didn't quite understand what Final Fantasy was from an older thematic perspective, like what the fundamentals were of it. And when I obviously went back and got more exposure to those games, I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. I can see where that's come from. Like, oh, that music's a reference to that specific track there. That's a very purposeful naming convention. And I guess in a roundabout way, one of the things I really liked about it was that the jobs were there, right? That, like, some things that were really, really core, like 7 and 8 and even 6 to a degree, they were very much, you can be whatever you want to be. You know, there are archetypes there, and, you know, like Aerith is a mage, but, you know, with the correct combinations and everything, she can still whack someone with that stick for a considerable amount of damage. And, you know, 8 was very similar to that as well. There are certain things, but most of those unique character traits relates to like limit breaks as opposed to the actual way they operate. Whereas 9 was just like, okay, Vivi is your black mage. That's what he does, you know. And there are all these different quirks that you had to try and figure out. And I think that when it came to selecting parties, that had a much bigger factor into who you wanted to use, because it was more about gameplay style as opposed to like, oh, I don't really like that character because of the way they spoke in that cutscene, or you know, like the visual aesthetic they had. And they played on it similar to, you know, how it was with the 4 and 6 era, where characters get taken away. You know, you get used to having a certain gameplay type or a party member that has a certain function, and they're no longer there anymore, or their role has changed because of something that happens in the story, and they've lost a certain command ability, or, you know, they've evolved the command ability. Those kind of things, like, kind of probably annoyed me at the time. But also, like, when you start to, you know, be a bit more mature about it, I guess, and understand like all the thematic elements from a narrative perspective that are happening, you know, they really help to resonate a lot more, I think. And I've always kind of felt that 9 is like technically the perfect game. Like, I don't think that there is another game in the series that is technically better in any particular area. That doesn't necessarily mean it's my favorite, but I can very much look at it and appreciate everything that's there. And I think that is because of what Sakaguchi brought to the table. It was basically like his baby. He went from 5 being his favorite to 9 being his favorite when it came out, because it was everything he wanted it to be. It was that like unexpected, I guess, swan song for him. I don't think he ever thought it was going to be the last one he made. Right. But, you know, it was kind of very fitting in a way that it turned out that way, I think.
Yeah. I have very similar feelings about Final Fantasy IX, where I think in the past, in videos that I've made, I've said things like, this is the best Final Fantasy game, right, even though it may not be my favorite or something like that. And it's for similar reasons. I think it just captures, as Sakaguchi himself has said, exactly what he had concocted in his mind as the ideal Final Fantasy for him. Of course, by this point, Final Fantasy was more than just him. There were lots and lots of contributions from lots of different extremely creative people who had made Final Fantasy into the success that it was. So, you know, we don't need to sit here and simp for Sakaguchi or anything like that. The success of the series was contributed to by many, many different people. But from his point of view as the creator, this was the ideal one. And he says here that the game was based on a reflection of all the previous works in the series. As this was the last single-digit Final Fantasy, we wanted to give the feeling of a series watershed, a sort of grand collection of what has come before. And Final Fantasy IX is full of references, like Daryll was talking about, to previous games in the series. And for those who have played the other games, you know, seeing those, you go, oh, that's from FF4. That musical motif there is from this game, or the name of this character is from Final Fantasy I, or you know, or things like that.
Like the disguise that Garnet wears at the beginning of the game, looking kind of like the white mage outfit, right?
Exactly.
It's just like, oh, so cool.
Exactly right. So it's full of things like that. I got a couple more quotes here from Shinji Hashimoto that I think are pretty interesting. He says, there was Final Fantasy VII, which was kind of a steampunk sci-fi. I don't necessarily love that people use the word steampunk to describe Final Fantasy VII. It's not quite what it is. It's more like postmodern kind of thing, but it feels like the 90s. It just feels like the tech from the 90s in a lot of ways.
It's just punk.
Yeah, just punk.
Just punk.
A punk sci-fi.
Punk with some steam sometimes.
There's some steam coming out of things.
It's punk steam. The steam comes
punk
second.
Steam.
Yeah.
I like that. So Final Fantasy VII is a punk steam game. Anyway, Final Fantasy VIII was a school story, a love story, a really human story set in a realistic city. For Final Fantasy IX, Sakaguchi-san wanted to go back to the action movie-like adventures of the first 6 Final Fantasy titles, and these elements are abundant in the game. There are numerous events crammed in to ensure that fans never get bored playing it, and it ultimately leads to an exciting and happy ending. There was this ideal world that he had in mind for his game, and I think he succeeded in making it. I also, this was something that was kind of fun for me to read. I hadn't known this before. One of my favorite classic fantasy films growing up was The Dark Crystal. And apparently that was quite an inspiration visually for this game. Where when I actually hear that, I go, oh yeah, I can see that now.
Yeah, me too.
I hadn't made that connection before.
So one of the things that people often complain about with this game is the look of the characters just in general, and the sort of animalishness that the characters all kind of have, but it's all a different animal for each one. And it's like, this is a strange feeling world. But if you look at the Dark Crystal, and especially the way, I think they're called Gelflings.
Gelflings, yes.
Yeah, the Gelflings. The way that they look almost sort of human, but they have these animal ears and this like kind of elongated palate just a little bit, sort of like a cat or something. But they really mostly just look sort of human. But there's this animal-like quality to them. I feel like that this has finally shored up my opinion or my mind on what exactly FF9 is like the look they were going for. Like it's not anime necessarily. It's not. It's more like puppets. Like he's trying to make these characters look and resemble something like a puppet from that era. And when did the Dark Crystal come out?
1980 something. I want to say 84.
Oh, was it that early?
It might have been. I don't think it was late 80s.
It wasn't 87?
I don't think it was 87.
Okay. Because returning back to the roots, that would just be perfect, wouldn't it? But yeah, the whole look and feel of that, I thought just it fits perfectly. As soon as I see that, I'm just like, oh, it all clicks now. It all clicks.
Yeah, I have a very similar feeling. And I remember first playing Final Fantasy IX and that being the thing that bothered me about it.
Yeah.
Almost in a similar way to say my first reactions to the introduction of Zelda Wind Waker or something like that, where it was such a different art style from what I expected that I was really put off by it at first. And then you actually play the game and you go, oh, this is amazing, right? Just like you actually get your hands on it. So that's kind of what my experience with Final Fantasy IX was like, where I looked at it at first and was just really put off by the faces in particular of the characters. It was like, I don't know how I feel, but they look very just sort of strange, maybe a little dead in the eyes.
Yeah, maybe a little
off-putting.
But the dead in the eyes look.
It's almost like a puppet.
Puppets, yeah.
Exactly.
Puppets have that look. And also Zidane has a tail, and some people call him Zidane. I'm aware of the differences. Every FF game, it's just like, wait, how do you pronounce? There's always a character that everyone pronounces differently and then tells you that you're wrong.
When I learned this, it really clicked for me too, like even further, because I already had learned to sort of like the way that the game looks and to sort of understand it. But again, when we talk about that sort of like puppet inspiration, that falls right in line with the diorama philosophy of like, he always wanted to make it look like a little world on a table.
Yep.
And
they're performing a play.
They're performing a play, these little characters.
So little people diorama play is better than high school drama. Right?
according
in his mind,
to Sakaguchi.
he's just like, clearly.
This goes all the way back to Final Fantasy IV. And for whatever reason today, I'm really struggling with names, but I'm pretty sure it's Takashi Tokita, who is sort of the assistant director.
He was the guy who was Sakaguchi cherry-picked to be the person who was spearheading 4. So he like wrote the story and also was lead game designer, just everything.
Yeah. He was essentially like the director of the game, though he's not credited as that, but I would call him that.
Yeah.
But he came from a theater background. So he studied theater in college. And you really saw that influence on Final Fantasy IV moving forward in sort of the storytelling. It became very dramatic and had a flair to the way the characters emoted and spoke that felt a little bit like a stage play.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, there were also cinematic aspirations. So it's all kind of mixed together. But in particular, with what we're talking about, with the diorama inspiration, the puppet inspiration, and especially with Final Fantasy VI, you get that operatic influence. There's no doubt that the presentation of the older classical Final Fantasy games was far more theatrical in presentation than strictly cinematic, though there were some cinematic inspirations. With Final Fantasy VII, that became much more equal, we'll call it, half cinematic, half theatrical.
Something like that, yeah.
And with Final Fantasy VIII, it leaned way more cinematic. And then with Final Fantasy X and with most of, if not all of, the modern Final Fantasy games, they have way more leaned into that cinematic approach to their presentational style. Whereas with Final Fantasy IX, it went back the other way and was definitely more theatrical. It really leaned into that a lot. And you get that a lot with even just the introduction, the first scene of the game. It is essentially a heist scene that is the way they're putting the wool over the eyes, so to speak, is with a literal flying theater production that comes in to put on a show for the kingdom while their heist kind of goes on behind the scenes. So the theater itself is the distraction of that opening scene. And there is really something to this that I think is so unique about Final Fantasy from this era, before they had voice acting, before they had the ability to move their cameras in really cinematic ways. I know there are some games from the PlayStation that did this, like Vagrant Story, but you didn't really start seeing it. And even Metal Gear Solid. Those were the two kind of pioneers, I feel like, for cinematic presentation. And that kind of took over how big budget AAA games went about, you know, presenting their stories. They became more like movies. And one thing that I really value about Final Fantasy from this era was that it leaned in a lot of times to a more theatrical presentation. And that kind of was a really nice way, I felt like, to marry these little Lego-looking people who quite often are, you know, emoting in these really big ways. The way they jump across the screen and the way they, whoa, anime does this a little bit too, where they can get like really, really abstract the way that they're getting across the idea of this character's anger, right? What's his name from Full Metal Alchemist, who turns into like a gremlin dude every time he gets pissed?
Yes, because he's short. People call him short. Alphonse and
Edward. Yeah. So, you know, that kind of thing. They lean into that a lot in these games, and they are very theatrical in that way, and it is a perfect presentational style for the marriage of its humor, which is abundant, with its really sentimental, deep emotional parts. It works for both things, and it makes it to where it doesn't feel weird to be going from this to this, kind of from one scene to another, in a way that it might feel weird in a really cinematically presented way. Right. And so I love that about Final Fantasy IX. I think it's executed extraordinarily well here.
So the history around 9 was that it was obviously being developed, and Square didn't know what it was going to be. There was a big kind of expose at the beginning of '99 where a publication called the Gaming Intelligence Agency published a load of documentation about the game. And I got a quote from the article they wrote themselves where they were talking about the fact that they didn't think it should be called Final Fantasy IX.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And they said Square has proven that the more realistic cinematic style RPG sells much better than the previous style. Why would they go through the effort of retooling their flagship franchise when it isn't broken? That was kind of like the way they were looking at it, and they believed that the game was very much being developed for those who liked Final Fantasy 1, 3, and 5 specifically, not 4 and 6. But they honestly believed that it was unlikely that Square were going to call it 9 because of how much confusion it would cause in the fan base, because they had created 2 separate audiences, and they just thought, there's literally no way that they would do this. And their guess was that it was going to be called Final Fantasy Gaiden as a result of that. And it was specifically around that. It was just very good that you mentioned that, because they specifically say it was because of the story delivery, the cinematic style that had been used in 7 and 8 was going to be very disparate in comparison to what they were going to presenting with this new game, and that it just wasn't going to vibe with people. That was their overriding sentiment from what they'd seen and what their insider had kind of told them about it. And even there was Shinji Hashimoto was asked around the same time in an interview whether they were working on 9, and he even said that yes, we are working on a big Final Fantasy game right now, but we don't know whether it's going to be called Final Fantasy 9 or not. And so it seems as though like they were really having discussions, and I know they had the same discussions with Final Fantasy 11 as well, in terms of, should this really be a mainline game, because it's so different from everything else that is people associate with the mainline games. And ultimately, Sakaguchi made the decision to say, this should be a mainline game because its story is so strong. And obviously they did the same with 9 as well. I just thought that was an interesting point to kind of dovetail with what you were saying about the delivery of the story being so different in comparison to those other 2 games, that clearly it was a real point of contention for them as well, because they knew exactly what they were doing, and they had a feeling that there may be some people that don't like this.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good point to bring up, because I feel like this series, even to this day, this was the hinge point upon which they couldn't really decide what Final Fantasy is. And so they had arguments internally. They're like, okay, you go do that over there. I'll go do my thing over here. We'll have this other team doing this thing over here. We'll all kind of go in different directions. But in particular, it's the point about what seems to me to be the executive leadership being concerned that we finally found it. We figured it out. We found the formula that sells millions, which is what we always wanted.
Yeah.
And it was 7 and 8.
Oh. Yes.
Like that was it. Like the cinematic style presentation is what we want. And that was just not what Sakaguchi had envisioned from the beginning for it to be. And again, this is not a statement from us on the panel about what is right or wrong. It's just an interesting development historically for this series, for those who are interested in it, to see this hinge point upon which Final Fantasy IX, while not selling badly per se, was, I think, at least less than half of that of 7.
Yeah.
And 8, I think, was up there in the near the 9 million mark, and I think 9 sold maybe 5 million total, or maybe just under that.
Something like that.
And so the answer to the executive leadership at that time would have been, lean more
do that one.
into Kitase's style of Final Fantasy. And then with the movie doing so badly and Sakaguchi really, coming into kind of a tight spot, stepping down from his executive leadership role, and then from there leaving the company, really. Yeah. It kind of just all swung that direction. I think it's really interesting to see how at this moment, this was kind of the decision that seemed to have been made based on results. But that all of a sudden you saw a real split in the fan base too, where you have fans of one title, but maybe not another one, and not understanding why this one's so different from this one. And then you see a wild swing in sort of the direction for the next title that comes out as a response to some of that feedback. But then you just get the people on the other side complaining about, okay, we'll swing back this way. And I think it has had some issues with that ever since then. And it's not to say anything other than this was sort of a fateful period of its history where the creator seems to have lost out on what his vision for the franchise should be. He exits Square, and ever since then, there's been kind of a struggle to find that again. And there's been lots of different ideas and lots of different teams developing. And well, we're where we are now. And as Daryll was alluding to, sometimes it's kind of hard to talk about Final Fantasy without, that kind of discourse coming up and sort of muddying the waters, so to speak.
Yeah.
But my response to that at this point is to do one's best, I feel like, to get into the reasons behind why specific choices are made for these games, and to try to understand the vision behind why they were trying to do what they were doing. Yeah. And I think when you do that for Final Fantasy IX in particular, which we're about to start going through beat by beat in the story, you'll if maybe you were a little, I don't know, iffy about this, you're more a fan of a certain different style Final Fantasy, you may see that there's some really, really profound stuff here. And I would say that's true for other titles as well. Yeah,
this game merits a deep dive, I think, for sure, because of this is the artist's vision as opposed to the market's forces dictated vision.
Sure.
And I mean, I was going to say, like, you brought up the sales as kind of a negative that people lobby against Final Fantasy IX, but as I'm more of a positive thinker these days, if you actually look at it from the perspective of 6, then it doubled sales.
I know. Oh yeah, it did very well.
And so I think it was just like people always want to compare it against 7 and 8.
Yep.
But if you compare it against 6, it's a much different comparison, because that's essentially what this game is a successor to. It's not a successor to 7 and 8. It shouldn't really be judged by the same criteria and standards. And then when you're looking at, 6 sold around 2.5 million copies ish. I think 3 if you're including in the American sales. Whereas 9's about like 5.5. So it from that perspective, it was very successful. Obviously, from a financial perspective, I think 9 cost more than 7 and 8 to make.
Yeah,
but Well, he had to build a whole studio in Hawaii.
Yeah, in Hawaii. I'm certainly not excusing some of the maybe in hindsight, not maybe the best financial decisions that were made surrounding all this.
But if your heart says you have to be in Hawaii, you just got to go.
But I do want to say, Daryll, that I wish what you had just said, I wish you had been on the panel discussion behind the scenes on the executive boards to explain this exact thing.
Reframe.
Listen, you're all judging these sales by 8 and 9 or 8 and 7 instead of by 6. Anyway.
So a few things. We've mentioned that this whole development was done in Hawaii, not Japan. But I just want to put it
completely. Yeah.
Not completely. Yeah. But I want to put a big exclamation point on the fact that there was, I can't remember how many. There were a ton of what they would consider just foreigners that they hired to work on this game. Yeah. And the development leadership was in Hawaii. And you could say that this is the first American developed Final Fantasy. It was actually this one. It was mostly developed in the United States. But despite the fact that Sakaguchi was creating this huge studio to make his movie, this game does not use motion capture, which is wild, something I learned through the developer interviews, and something that also was maybe done intentionally.
Yeah.
Because they wanted that puppet-like
puppet feel to
they
it,
didn't
yeah.
want it to feel so realistic and all that stuff.
It's a great point.
They also had to create these dioramas of the characters' heights because Sakaguchi kept telling them, no, that desk is too small. Like these things aren't right. Like Zidane is short, but he's a short person relative to otherwise would be a normal sized thing. So everything needs to be big to him.
Yeah.
Basically, he's a hobbit.
Yeah.
And the people kept designing things for his size, and they ended up kind of having to create this big flowchart of what the size, because all the characters' size varies so significantly. All the different characters in the game, that sometimes when you're just working on a scene with 1 or 2 or 3 of the characters, you don't realize how big everything is supposed to be relative to everybody else.
So that's why it was done that way. And I think understanding why helps someone sort of understand what they're going for. And that's kind of the purpose of these intro episodes that we do for the podcast. As much as possible, we want to try to understand that because like Daryl explained, and like my experience with Final Fantasy IX, your first impression of that, without understanding where they're coming from, you might go, whoa, that's not what Final Fantasy is supposed to look like. Right. They're supposed to look like really dope anime characters with spiky hair and stuff like that.
And big swords.
What happened? Yeah. But, then you look into it, you actually play the previous games in the series, you read the interviews, you try to understand where they're coming from. And it's like, oh, this is actually really cool what they're going for here. And I think it's really effective at the same time.
But this is just a little unfortunate that Hironobu Sakaguchi positioned himself so hardly in this camp because the differences of FF7 between all the ones that had come before it were the first impression was, wow, that's awesome, right?
Yes.
Everyone who loved FF6, unless you're lying, loved FF7 when you first saw it. When you first played it, you were like, this is incredible. And you may have later gone back and said FF6 is better. I understand that. But everyone's first reaction to 7 was that this is dope. And everyone's first reaction to 9 is that this is weird, but upon further contemplation or playing it more or researching the previous games and going back, now I really understand it and appreciate it. Which one of those two do you think wins out in the marketing executive boardroom?
It also goes into Kitase, right? Because Kitase came from that film background, and you think about the introductions of 7 and 8. You've got the really cool sequence with all the camera work and Cloud flipping off a train, and then in 8 you've got the Liberi Fatale, which is such a high impact sequence.
Yeah, that CG scene,
Paul and Cypher at the end, and then it's like with 8, it's like that huge, incredible orchestral piece of music, Liberi Fatale sequence, and then all of a sudden you're sitting in a bed. Everything stops, but you're like, whoa. And then you have a bit of calm, and you go to the landing, which is such a cool sequence as well, which is also it has really high action, but also really calming low moments.
Yes.
Whereas 9 was, I think the opening sequence was, it was a lot more campy, theatrical.
Yeah, campy is probably the right word,
And you have the crash, and it was a very different sentiment. I think to what I was used to from the storytelling we were going for throughout the 2 previous games. I was going to ask you actually, Mike, in terms of the art direction specifically, because when I was researching the creative team that worked on 9. It seemed as though I remember seeing somewhere that Sakaguchi talked about kind of wanting to get that old group back together, like the ones that hadn't gone on to make their own things, like Tanaka and Kitase and that. The ones that were still kind of like loose, that had worked on the original games. He wanted to get them back to try and bring back the spirit, because he felt the teams had got too big and no one really knew each other anymore.
So he moved the whole thing to Hawaii.
But it seemed like he kind of got a handful of people he really trusted. And then everyone else was just kind of brand new. A lot of the people that were doing the illustrations, obviously from 1 through 6, Amano and Shibuya were really integral in terms of coming up with the characters and how they looked in game. And then obviously with 7 and 8, it was Nomura who took over the role. But then with 9, you had Itahana, who was essentially a new employee at the company. He'd joined from Namco after working on the Mystery Dungeon games. And then the other two guys that were like the principal character designers had never worked at Square before.
Right.
And then they had about, I don't know, 10, 15 people in charge of additional character design. And Minaba was the art director who hadn't really like staked a claim on anything. I mean, Tactics obviously was a big role for him, but the art style of Tactics was also very similar to kind of Ogre Battle. So it seemed as though, you know, Matsuno had a very clear vision about what he wanted it to look like.
Yeah.
And I wonder with this one, it was that Sakaguchi, he got people in that he knew were really in tune with the way that he thought, that were senior. And then they got a load of quite junior people that were very impressionable to be like, this is the game you are going to make, and there's going to be no discussions about this. This is the way it is.
Yes.
I wonder. I actually think that's a pretty good that sounds about right.
Yeah, well, and Ito himself is a good example of this because he had been involved from the beginning.
Yeah, he's one of the few who had been involved since FF1.
Right. And he was in a very junior kind of role, more minor role on 1 through 3. And then it was with 4 where he came in as like the principal battle designer for the series.
Yeah.
And he was brought on to sort of direct this game. And Sakaguchi's, the way he sort of split up teams kind of from the beginning was more of the adventure team, and then you had the battle team.
Yeah,
so you had like the team that did all the systems and the RPG stuff, and then you had the team over here developing the story and designing the characters and doing the fun the story stuff. Yeah. And Sakaguchi was on that side. Yeah. He was on the adventure side mostly. And so Ito was his battle system guy. Right. And so he was the director of the game, but he had also been around from the beginning. So like you're saying, Daryll, you know, he kind of understood like all the way back at the roots what this thing was about.
And even with Tactics, you know, when you're thinking about like Matsuno was kind of an unknown quantity for Sakaguchi. Ito was the guy who was like, right, I'm going to trust you to make sure this project goes well. Yeah. You're going to be my eyes and ears essentially on this game. Yeah. And it obviously worked out really well. And yeah, it seemed like Ito is very much like his right-hand man. He was the guy who was just like, okay, I'm going to put you in charge of this. And obviously, you know, they had disagreements throughout 9 as well in terms of the story delivery and things like that. But it seemed as though it was more, they were on the same page. It was just figuring out, you know, instead of going like slightly left or slightly right, they pick one of those. It's not like a U-turn.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it didn't like change everything.
I think you're right. I think that he definitely constructed this team, Sakaguchi that is, hoping to avoid some of the discussions, I like that word you've been using, that were happening previous to that with Kitase and the other side of things. You brought up Itahana, Toshiyuki Itahana, who has an interesting quote here that I took down as well. He says, it has classic designs and a very unique sort of feel to it. Using that as inspiration, I should put him a little more clarity here. He's talking about the Dark Crystal when he says this. The Dark Crystal has classic designs and a very unique feel to it. Using that as inspiration, we went on to create a literary imaginary world, something like you would find in a fairy tale. We wanted to create the sort of world that a child might dream up. Using that, we were able to come up with some quite interesting and original characters with all sorts of shapes and sizes. So I think that's probably enough to solidify the direction that they were going, Sakaguchi's insistence on it being a very specific way that was different from the foundation from a lot of things they did in 8 in particular.
Even with that being said, he also gave the team a ton of freedom laterally, especially the writers and the what would you call them? The scenario writers for specific sequences within the game, that he gave them a lot of freedom to write dialogue and to kind of engage with the story in the smaller elements here. Maybe not the overarching story that Sakaguchi wanted to tell, but they had a lot of freedom within each sequence to kind of like take ownership and be the director within each sequence. Yeah. So he did give them that. That's pretty good.
You know, that is something that I think is really I'm glad you brought that up, because I think with any popular game series or movie or just anything, I think a lot of people try to apply that same kind of authorial vision to one creator in more collaborative mediums like games and movies, where you have, I mean, just giant teams, hundreds of people working on them. And Final Fantasy in particular, I mean, going all the way back to its origins, the original president of the company, right? Back then, games were made by one guy, or maybe sometimes two guys that were roommates in college or whatever. Right? And his idea was to have a team working together. You know, you have designers and programmers and someone doing music who are doing different jobs that are specialized for that thing. That was kind of his sort of unique approach to how to design a video game at Squaresoft when they were first, you know, getting off the ground. And that continued to, I think, develop and grow in the way they even approached story. It was never just one guy writing the story for these Final Fantasy games. They had, you know, 5 or 6 different people who were writing different scenarios for different characters. Or in like Final Fantasy VII's case, you have Kazuhiko Nojima, is that his name? Who was kind of, he's credited as like the script writer or like the like actual like writer. But like he handled specific scenarios like the scenario where Cloud and Tifa are in the live stream and Cloud's sort of like exploring his actual past and things like that, right? Like that's him. And then you have Toriyama directed like the Honeybee Inn sequence and the whole Sector 5 part. And you had, of course, Nomura, who wrote a whole bunch of stuff for like the Cloud and Sephiroth sort of like rivalry that was based on samurai, like actual samurai legends of two swordsmen. And then Sakaguchi himself, his contributions were more along the lines of like the world and the Gaia hypothesis and returning to the planet and these sorts of elements of the story's main theme, right? So you had these large teams that were contributed to by many, many people. And so Final Fantasy IX was no different in that respect. As you're saying, there were many people who wrote different parts of it. And I think it's so impressive as someone who is, you know, a writer myself, to write a story in that way. It seems so counterintuitive to me to have different people separate from each other writing different scenarios and then try to like glue those together in a way that makes sense and where the character writing is consistent from one scene to the next.
You don't want to lose the voice.
Exactly. And it seems to not have ever happened in these Final Fantasy games. They seem to have made that work pretty much every time really consistently, which I think is really impressive. So
yeah, I think you know, obviously the person who was in charge of the kind of the overall narrative design for 9 was Kazuhiko Aoki, who was also an old school Square guy who had been there. I mean, like you're talking about, you know, Hiromichi Tanaka and Sakaguchi. Aoki was like the number 3 guy during that period, but he was always the wacky one, right? He was doing like Hanjaku Hero and like making all these weird, crazy games that no one else really wanted to make or could conceive. And I think that really comes through in 9 as well. Like it's got so much humor in there. But yeah, like I think the approach that they used is like the way they went about it, I think was really smart. And it was something that I don't know if Kitase necessarily brought to the table, but I know that when they went into 6, there were kind of big changes with design philosophy and making it a lot more inclusive. And because before that, it was kind of Sakaguchi was sitting at the top to be like, you know, this is what I want. Whereas Kitase was a lot more flexible. He was like, okay, guys, anyone got any ideas? Anyone want to contribute stuff? And I know Uematsu spoke about that with Sakaguchi was quite militant. Like, this is what I want, and this is how it's going to be done. Whereas Kitase was like, okay, Nobuo, like, you know, what kind of music do you think would suit this scene or something? It was a lot more collaborative, and he was quite surprised by that. But obviously with 6, Kitase was that guy who had to sew everything together. He would take all of the individual things and figure out, how can I make this work?
That seems to be one of his strengths, I've noticed. Yeah. That he's a really good manager of like all many different constituent elements.
Yeah, like as a director, he really like embodied that spirit of like allowing everyone to have that authority and ownership. I mean, with 7, I think he came out and said that the first time he knew about Zach's existence was when he played through a play test of the game, and he found out he was in there, and they were like, "Oh, they made the story make sense." Okay, fair play, guys.
Yeah.
Wow.
There could be some negatives to that with the director
Right.
not knowing, but it panned out okay in the end. But I think they always had that like Nojima was really good at that, like being that story oracle, like knowing how to fit everything together. I don't know if he necessarily came up with too much of the story himself, but he was really, really good at figuring out ways to make all these ideas that people have just fit together. And with 9, they obviously introduced the active time element sequences. And I think that was one of those things where Sakaguchi felt that, okay, let's give some autonomy back to the team so they can come up with these fun sequences for these characters that really give a lot of personality. Like, you don't have to watch them if you don't want to,
right?
But if you do, then they're really fun and engaging, and you get to see these fun backstories about the characters. There's usually some kind of comedy involved with them at some point.
With Steiner or Kina or Vivi or there's always something fun. Sure. Is there anyone who skips those? Is there anyone who doesn't immediately push the button each time?
Well, I think you might miss some by accident, right? If you don't go in the right areas.
Oh, it's true. Well, if you don't enter certain places on the map, you might not actually see them. Yeah,
I suppose I see that. Accidentally missing.
Yeah. Okay. We'll ask that to the audience. Did you skip the optional little active time events?
Not do it. I remember there was one time where I didn't do it because I had to save because my mom said I had to clean my room. I remember thinking, "Oh, I'll watch it later," and not being able to, and being extremely disappointed because I just had to get through it quickly to get to a save point.
You hear that, Square? If you are working on a Final Fantasy IX remake, make it so that you can go back and review those if you missed them on accident.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
People want to see those. Okay, I think this is a good place to pivot a little bit. So what we do primarily on this podcast is we break down the storytelling of the games that we cover. So we focus mostly on the literary elements and the techniques behind them and the symbolism and what it all means kind of at its core. And so we kind of want to set up this analysis with quotes and ideas from the developers on what they were going for with this story. So I have another quote here from Itahana. Ultimately, what we did was set an overall theme for the game that was, quote unquote, living, with an exclamation mark, he says. It's very important. Living! Right? We felt that if we showed how the different characters strived and lived their lives to the fullest, it would make the game more interesting. The theme behind this game was that nobody can run from the truth and what is right, and it emphasizes the fact that it is something you have to think about. I think it's a story that resonates with people, no matter the era. In addition to that, we have another quote here from, I'm so bad with Japanese names, Nobuo Uematsu, who says, "One letter that I really can't forget was from a boy who I think was a middle schooler. In this letter, he said that he had been thinking of ending his life. Then he played Final Fantasy IX and saw how Vivi and Zidane, along with everyone else, lived their lives with all their hearts. This made him feel that he needed to keep on striving and living as well. I remember that letter so clearly. After that, I went and locked myself in the restroom and cried for a while. While I was busy creating the game, I just got absorbed in the work and sometimes lost that sense of what we're making. But I have a really strong memory of seeing how we had undoubtedly reached out and touched the players." And then a quote from Kazuhiko Aoki. "Before, I used to think that this job wasn't that important, that it wasn't something that the world needed. It could disappear at any moment and the world would be no worse off. But recently I've started to hear from various people who tell me things like how they stayed up all night playing my games when they were in middle school. And I've started to feel that what we do is part of creating important memories that people cherish in the same way that my contemporaries think back on popular songs from when we were little. So over the past 5 years or so, I've started to think that maybe what I do might have some value for the world after all." So a couple of really powerful quotes there that I wanted to bring up essentially to say this. there is something about this series and games like it from the era that in all of my years of creating content on the internet, which has kind of weaved in and out of just coming back to this series in particular and talking about
right.
its impact on me as a child, I have always known somehow that it was more than just a video game, a toy, a way to pass time, something that's just fun to sit down as a distraction for a while. I had games like that, and I'm not even saying anything negative about games where that's all their goal is.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that when I played Final Fantasy for the first time, I immediately knew there was something deeper about this than just being one of those types of things. This was touching on something that made me reflect on my own life and the world around me and think about it in a deeper way as a 10-year-old or something, right? As a young person. Right. It was encouraging me to begin thinking about life in a different way. And for that alone, I feel like these are just as important and formative for me as any classic work of art I've encountered. And it's what made me realize that games are art, that they can be those types of transformational experiences. And Final Fantasy IX, along its contemporaries at the time, was certainly shooting for telling a story that touched the players in that way. And, you know, we've talked about this at great length in our other podcast series on Final Fantasy X and the ways in which it tries to do that. Final Fantasy VI and the ways that it tries to do that, Final Fantasy Tactics, the ways it tries to do that, and many others. In this game in particular, I feel like what stands out to me and what I might watch out for if you're playing this for the first time yourself is how you come to terms with your own mortality, limitations, the fact that you can't do everything on your own. You need support from others. And dealing with the hard questions of life and finding a reason, finding a purpose, even when it seems impossible, even when it seems there's no purpose, even when you are struggling to find a reason to go on. Right. That to me is really at the core of what Final Fantasy IX explores.
Yeah, I mean, it was, as I said, it struck different emotional chords to me than other games I played. And yeah, Final Fantasy for me was one of those franchises. I mean, I'd typically been playing very action heavy games. So throughout the Mega Drive, it's like, you know, Sonic, Streets of Rage, like, you know, there was no real story to those games. I mean, there was a story, but it was very loose. I got most of my story from the Sega Sonic the comic strips that they had, as opposed to the games themselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, like Command and Conquer, they had stories, but it was tongue-in-cheek, you know, it wasn't overly developed. And I think Final Fantasy VII was the first game I played where things actually happened. There were consequences to them. And then 8 and 9 were where the emotions started to really come in for me, and I started to pay more attention to things or the music in a different way. And 9, you know, you mentioned about the fact that you need a team. You know, there's obviously the very impactful scene towards the end of the game where Zidane is very selfish, and he's feeling, you know, let down by a lot of things, lied to, and the incredible Uematsu track plays, which I'm going to talk around this so we don't go too far ahead of ourselves.
Sure.
But, you know, I remember going through that scene and I was just thinking, I feel how Zidane feels in this moment. Like I feel frustrated, and, you know, the interactions that he was with the characters, I was kind of feeling the same way too. And I hadn't really experienced a video game that had made me feel that way before, but also in other ways too. I mean, Steiner, for the large portions of that game, really annoyed me. Really annoyed me.
Yeah.
and that was his job. Like that was the way his character was meant to be written. But I wasn't used to a game that was pushing me in that way. You know, his entire function was to just be a thorn in Zidane's side. He just never trusted him. He was always like really downbeat or like deprecating towards him. I'd not really experienced that in that dynamic before in a video game, and it was really compelling. I wanted to see how that dynamic evolved over time. And also, you know, the relationship with Zidane and Garnet was quite mature as well. I feel, you know, he was this kind of like womanizer, and I know there's stuff about Sakaguchi and Kitase wanted to make him more of a womanizer.
Yeah, apparently they deleted most of those scenes, which is like, wow, dude. All right, it's going to be every 5 minutes.
I think, you know, there were so many like relationships that developed in that game. It was so multifaceted. I mean, you have the relationship with Vivi and Quina and Quan, like that whole strange dynamic. Vivi and the other black mages. You have Freya and Sifratli and her having to deal with that. I think Freya's storyline as an overall is incredibly compelling. Like everything she has to go through, the journey she goes through. I think it's a shame that it goes through the typical kind of Final Fantasy of that era trope where they kind of get to a point in the story and then they just have their resolution and they disappear.
It just kind of goes away for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I loved that, you know, there were consequences to things. And I think, yeah, like just the way that they went about all of that and crafting that and making it so tight as well, with having all the humor in there, the way it bounces between those two things, I think it does it masterfully.
It's like it's a little bit different from the themes of previous games. I would say maybe it's a little more ambitious. It also could be a little more important than the themes of the previous games. Yeah. And of course, a lot of this stuff goes back to, you know, Hironobu Sakaguchi's kind of mindset after his mother had passed away.
True.
And that kind of led to him slowly putting more and more of this, you know, content into his game, you know, culminating up to FF9 and ultimately Spirits Within.
Yes.
Of like how, like what is life kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you can see it growing, and FF9 in terms of the game is the part where he inserts it there the most poignantly.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That's really important to bring up. That Sakaguchi's evolution of his thoughts about life and what's important in life and what it means to live were directly influenced by that event.
Yeah,
which I think happened going all the way back to when Final Fantasy III. III was in development. Yeah. So this would have been probably like 80, 89 or 90, somewhere in that range when his mother passed away. And so through that entire decade of the 1990s, I mean, his continuing sort of development thoughts, trauma and reflection on what his mother meant to him is very much reflected in the central themes that you see in the Final Fantasy games through that decade. So through the Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1 era titles. And it's powerful stuff. And it's why the series, I think, ultimately, I mean, of course, many other contributions. They always had awesome characters, and they were always very funny and had a nice balance, like Daryll was saying, between its comedic elements, and the music is just so perfect all the time.
Gosh, that's so good.
And so like everything obviously is incredibly polished, but at the center of that beautiful polished product, at least in my estimation, is exactly that event that affected that man in that way. And his sort of weaving his reflections on life into the stories of those games in ways that are universal for everyone, because everyone has those events happen in their life where they lose someone who's dear to them, or where they come across a really, really hard choice they have to make about loyalty versus what they think is right, and not being able to run away from that choice being put on them, those difficult things that come up. And I think Final Fantasy, why it was so special and why it was so popular and so had such widespread appeal is largely due to that being that sort of core central foundation that everything else sort of orbited around. And in this game, it's definitely powerful. You can feel that as you're playing it. And so as you're playing through the game, if this is your first time playing it alongside us, that would be something that I would point to and say, maybe look at that while you're playing it and pay attention to how you feel and pay attention to what stories from your own life come up in response to what you're seeing. How it is that it helps you relate to what you're seeing on screen. That's where I think you're going to have the best experience with games like Final Fantasy IX.
I was reading that Nobuo Uematsu actually wrote the music for FF9, much of it, to be recorded live, and then hearing how it all went live, then he went back and rewrote the MIDI track for PS2.
I did not know that.
So he, this is a quote from Uematsu. Another thing I did different in FF9 was that instead of creating the songs via sequencing directly into the computer, I recorded live versions of the song and then did the sequencing afterwards, trying to capture the energy and expression of the live performances.
Amazing.
Isn't that cool?
That's really cool.
That's really cool. And this was the first game that he did that for. So he wrote a bunch of music for live. A lot of the music for FF7 and even FF8, some in FF9 as well, of course, is done on instruments that are hard to replicate live. They're more digital sounding instruments.
Especially
FF9
7,
though, especially 7. FF9 though has very much so this more kind of Germanic, this sort of classical kind of instrument feel to it. And because of that, he was able to just kind of hire an orchestra and be like, all right, play these songs. And then he could feel where naturally things just kind of, swelled and picked up, and he was able to kind of replicate that in the sequencing afterwards. Very, very brilliant way to write, I think, if you have the budget for it, which it seems like they did.
Yeah.
Didn't he also say that he took full advantage of the extra budget to do like lots of let's say principal photography trips to like Europe and spend a lot of time in Hawaii just so that he could get the vibe for what it would be like to.
And when he went to Europe, he wanted to purchase but apparently there's some issue with playing stuff from Europe, especially back in the 90s, on Japanese equipment that he had. And it's not compatible, so he had to buy new stuff. He had to buy NTSC or that's the video stuff. Europe is PAL. But for the stuff that he wanted to listen to, he ended up having to buy all this extra equipment as well so that he could take all that stuff home with him. But he really loved the Irish music, even though it didn't influence the music as much.
Yeah,
but he loved listening to it, and then he was writing for more of a Germanic kind of like.
I remember reading a while ago that he, on that trip to Europe, he went to a lot of taverns, and he was trying to get a feel for medieval style music, and of course that it's not solely that. There's a lot of Uematsu sort of quirky way of working in experimental ideas into stuff and mixing and matching genres, but you definitely hear that, like you're saying, Germanic, European, medieval sort of style in a lot of instrument choice and things like that. Yeah. And that was something they did a lot during this era. They would travel they would just take the team. They were just going to get up and go look at castles for 2 weeks and draw them to get inspiration for how we should do our backgrounds and how we should do our designs
and that's how a game costs $40 million.
Yes, exactly.
There you go.
Exactly
now you know.
Right. Yeah, it gets up there quick. Final Fantasy VII, in a lot of ways, was kind of the first AAA video game, and sort of like set the stage for that. Yeah, I guess extremely high budget blockbuster like video game.
Well, because it had a 9-figure advertising budget.
Yes.
Which is unbelievable.
So they kind of started that trend. So these were exceptionally expensive video games to make, but they paid off. They sold extremely well. They were very, very well made, and have a special place in most of our hearts, which is why we're still talking about it for hours, 30-ish years later. All right, so for the next episode, we'll be playing all the way up through what we talked about there or hinted at was that opening heist sequence. So that's the portion of the story we'll be discussing next week. So right up to where they get into the forest.
Very nice.
Right.
It's a good way of putting it.
So that's kind of where we're going to stop, is right when they get into the forest. I don't want to talk about the circumstances of how they get into there, but when you arrive at a forest, that's when we'll be stopping for next week. So that's what we'll be discussing there.
Perfect.
So play up to that point, come back next week, and we'll discuss. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Daryll, for joining us. I'm glad we finally had a chance to sit down and talk. It's
Thanks
been
for having me.
Way too long that we've been sort of chatting behind the scenes, but never actually sat down and talked. So I'm glad you were here for this. Thank you. And we will see everybody next time. Peace.